Welcome to Faith in 5, a weekly video devotional designed to discuss practical spiritual concepts in 5 minutes or less. I'm your host, Mark Vandella. One of my favorite speakers is Patrick Lencioni, and he always has a great way of telling funny stories, but they have applicable messages. And oftentimes when he speaks on the nature of conflict, he tells a story, or actually he first engages his crowd by saying, hey, around conflict, what industry do you think is the worst at handling conflict? And inevitably somebody in the crowd yells out, churches. And he says, yes, absolutely. And why is that? Because we hire a bunch of jerks? No, it's because we hire people who are too loving and too kind, or at the very least, doing so is at the expense of something else. And so he says they have almost too much grace. And in a work environment, and usually the topics that he's talking about are in that vein, we need to engage conflict, and we can't ignore it or avoid it. Oftentimes when it comes to faith, we choose to do one or the other. We either avoid it altogether because we're so grace-focused and grace-filled. But many of us have experienced, and the reason a number of us have run as far away from religion and God as possible is because of this law, truth side of the puzzle. I picture the guy on the street corner just yelling at people for how bad they are, how wrong they are, how hot they're going to live the rest of their lives in hell. That's too far on one side. And see, God gets a bad reputation when we choose one or the other. Lencioni tells a story about a church committee who somebody throws out a kind of a dumb idea. He always, I don't know why he chooses it, but he always says a parade of balloons, and everybody around the table thinks it's dumb, but nobody says anything. And then they go out to their cars, and that person whose idea it was isn't there, and they're all saying, ha ha, parade of balloons, can you believe it? What an idiot, blah, blah, blah. They may not say what an idiot, but essentially that's what they're communicating. And then they come back 4 weeks later, and this person has chased this idea. They've got people excited about it, and then you're like, wait, what? Now he said, we had a moment to just address the idea. We could do so in a grace-filled way, but by speaking truth. And now, 4 weeks later, we don't just crush the idea, we crush her spirit. He said that we need to stand in the middle. We need to do both grace and truth. And Jesus actually paints that picture. When John introduces Jesus in his first book, he says that the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. He says the Word became flesh. My friend Kelsey Jenny, who's a gifted speaker, says that that Word became flesh is God in a bod. So God in a bod moved into the neighborhood. He came and dwelled among us. And then it goes on to say that when this happens, we start to see His glory because Jesus is full of grace and truth. We don't have to choose. Jesus came and lived a life full of both so that we can live out both, because God gets a bad reputation when we choose either or. The best example, so that's in the first chapter of John. Later on in the 8th chapter of John, the best example of this grace and truth at the same time is when Jesus has an adulterous woman brought before him. And in those cultural times, there were some religious leaders who would often go out and try to find these people, or if they caught somebody doing wrong, they would bring them before a committee, and those people would be punished for their bad behavior. And so they're actually doing two things. They're trying to punish this woman, but they're also at this time trying to catch Jesus, because Jesus brought both grace and truth, and these people wanted truth and law and truth and law. And so they bring this lady before him and said, what would you have us do? The penalty for this is stoning. And Jesus says, anybody that hasn't sinned, feel free, line up, cast the first stone. And so Jesus speaks into each of our lives. We oftentimes are the people on the other side holding a stone. When we grab a hold of truth alone and don't include grace, we stand with rocks in our hands. And Jesus says, if you can say you haven't sinned, then go ahead. They all drop their stones and they walk away one by one. And he says to the woman, he says, have you anybody to condemn you? And she looks around and she says, no, He says, and I don't condemn you either. Grace. Jesus is full of grace, but he's also full of truth. He finishes it with one little statement that says, now go and sin no more. See, he knows, and in that moment, he communicates to her that the sin is not my biggest concern, it's you. You are my biggest concern, and this behavior is bad for you. It hurts other people. So I'm not condemning you, but the truth is, this is dangerous, and this is harmful, and this is bad. That's the reputation that Jesus came to tell, the story he came to tell on God's behalf, is this combination of grace and truth. And so as you examine your faith life, look for the places where maybe you need to speak some truth, you need to be held accountable to some truth, but also look for the places that you can do that with grace. If I had to choose, I would choose grace over truth. But Jesus comes and says we don't have to choose. We can do both. So in your faith life, consider how you can live in equal parts, grace and truth.